Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.
Now, there are some critical issues.
Richard Stallings says he wants to debate those critical issues with George Hansen, but this week he seemed to all but rule out a face-to-face debate until Hansen reveals more about his personal finances. Hansen and Stallings were together just yesterday. Both of them were talking. Hansen was listening while Stallings was talking, at times hardly believing what his opponent had to say. Tonight, the Hansen and Stallings campaigns, how they're taking shape. Good evening. There was some new confusion today over whether George Hansen and Richard Stallings will debate each other during their campaign this fall. Hansen, the incumbent Republican, and Stallings, the Democratic challenger, are of course running for Congress in Idaho's 2nd Congressional District. On Monday of this week, Stallings held a series of news conferences across his district, saying in essence that a debate on the issues with Hansen was impossible until the congressman clears up questions about his personal finances. But just today, we've learned that the Stallings campaign informed the Idaho League of Women Voters earlier this month that Stallings had accepted an invitation to debate Hansen on October 18th in Pocatello. Hansen has accepted that same invitation and seemed ready even to mix it up with Stallings when the two appeared before a realtors convention here in Boise just yesterday. But actually not much happened, with Stallings arriving just before his speech and leaving just after finishing it. The apparent reluctance to debate Hansen has caught many Idaho political observers by surprise. The conventional political wisdom has been that Stallings should use every chance available to allow voters to compare him with a congressman who is a convicted felon and has been reprimanded by his colleagues. But here's what Stallings had to say about the debate situation on Monday.
I'm not going to be jerked around by his whims. He will operate on our standards. He will meet our schedules, or there will be no discussion with him. And it's time that he faced up to the people of this district, faced up to me as a candidate. 2 years ago, he wouldn't even admit that he had an opponent. Now, all of a sudden, he's awfully hungry to meet with me. And I'm not that interested with him.
Stallings told reporters at this Boise news conference that every poll he's seen puts him 15 to 30 points ahead of Congressman Hansen. He was asked if that's the real reason he's not interested in a debate.
2 years ago, I tried to debate him, and we were running very close at that point. I showed up 3 different times to debates that he did not appear. In one case, he sent a surrogate. I will not be jerked around like that.
Again, that news conference was one of several Stallings held on Monday this week. The two were together yesterday, sort of, at a Boise Board of Realtors meeting. Both of them spoke, but at Stallings' insistence, there was no debate. Instead, Hansen spoke first and then waited around to hear what Stallings had to say.
It was very interesting. For a long time, the press tried to make it sound like I was the only one that ever had a fight over how to fill out a government form, and that was akin to being a brother to Jack the Ripper. And now we find out that after they were saying that I was some kind of a real bad guy, that there's another individual on the scene who has the same kind of difficulties, only for, in that case, they're running her for vice president. So it's interesting sometimes how these things develop and how you get treated. And I just wanted you to know that there's been lots of disclosure. And when my critics who say there isn't enough disclosure get up to those 2,500 pages on their own, then I think we can talk more about disclosure. In the meantime, this last week, I thought it was very interesting that there was some complaint about how can you get to the issues if all you can have to talk about is Hansen's fight with the government. Well, frankly, I'd love to talk issues, and I plan to talk issues, but when your opposition is paying for advertisement, talking about these things, and then complaining about the fact that he has to talk about them, I think there's something to be said for that. I want you to know I'm not paying to talk about this. I would pay and plan to pay in my political advertisement, talk about the issues that affect you. And I think that's, after all, the most important thing. Not my taxes, not my opponent's taxes, not Geraldine's taxes or anybody else's, but your taxes and your problems, how the government affects you. And so I think that, again, what we need in Washington is somebody that will go to the wall to help. Now, I hear people criticize the fact that maybe when somebody gets into a problem, whether it's in Bolivia or Nebraska or Iran or whatever, that George Hansen's off doing something there when he ought to be doing something for Idaho. Well, I didn't think that you had to sacrifice the country for the benefit of Idaho. I think they go hand in hand. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm there to fight for you, and I can fight for you as long as you fight for me. And I think this country's worth fighting for. And they say every generation has to pay a price. Our founding fathers paid a price for freedom, and every generation has to pay that price or you lose the freedom. Freedom isn't free. And if you're willing to fight, and if I'm willing to fight, we're going to keep the traditions of the founding father, and we're going to keep America what we hope it will be, and we're going to keep it for the dreams and the aspirations of our children and their children. Thank you very much.
Hansen's opponent, Richard Stallings, had originally been asked to speak first before this group, but he declined, and he was not in the room to listen to Hansen's speech. Instead, he arrived just before his own presentation, concentrating his remarks on 3 ideas he said were important to what he termed a quest for quality.
I think, first of all, we must look at the question of time. How much time is an elected official willing to spend on the job? A public official must spend all of his time on the people's business. We have currently essentially a part-time congressman. We have a man who is deeply involved in a series of other kinds of projects that don't relate to the affairs of this state. I have no objections to crusades. I have no problems with going out and taking on this agency or that agency, but not on my time. If I hire a man to do a job and he spends his time in extraneous affairs, then my job is not getting done. The national average for attendance at Congress this last year is about 92%. Our congressman finds himself there only 79%. The second quality is that of trust. The congressman must have the trust not only of the people who's elected him, but the trust of his colleagues. And I find it very interesting that this trust seems to be lacking, not only from the people that make up the 2nd District. My experience as I travel throughout the 2nd District is that trust has somewhat been tarnished. In the halls of Congress, the same question arises. Can trust be maintained? The third is the question of judgment. We quite often hear the notion that people lack experience, that they're not qualified because they've not had experience. What does experience necessarily prove? I think what we need to look for, more than experience, is judgment. How do you handle your own personal affairs? I have avoided debt in campaigns. I have avoided debt in my own personal life. I cannot and will not advocate the borrowing of oneself out of debt. It cannot be done. And I think that to do otherwise is foolish. We are at a crossroads. This state, like the other states, must move beyond partisan petty politics. It must move beyond self-serving congressmen and senators. It must lead this nation into the direction that our founders, when they put together that marvelous document, they wanted us to go. We must be independent, financially independent. We must work as people, not necessarily as Democrats and Republicans. We must work as a unit to resolve these problems. And only when we do that will we really achieve the kind of future that our young people demand and that our young people deserve.
To help us look further at how the Hansen-Stallings race in the 2nd District is shaping up, we have with us tonight several reporters who've been covering the campaign. In Pocatello tonight, Bob Black, who covers politics for the Idaho Falls Post-Register newspaper. And in Boise, Sam Lang, who covers politics for the Idaho Press-Tribune newspaper in Canyon County. Bruce Botka, a reporter with United Press International's bureau in Boise. And my colleague on these broadcasts, Gene McNeil, the executive producer of Idaho Reports. Gene, just what is the story today on the debate?
Well, I've been sorting it out for a day and a half now, but I think I may finally have it clear, and it's rather confusing. First of all, we're talking about a series of debates proposed by the League of Women Voters and the Idaho Press Club. The debates have been held essentially every 2 years since 1978, so this would be the fourth installment of them. They're carried on public television. Apparently, the Stallings campaign sent the League a letter of acceptance on the 3rd of August, as you indicated. And in reading it, it's a very clear letter. There was one little area that needed to be clarified between the League and the Press Club and the Stallings campaign. But essentially, with that exception, it was a very clear acceptance letter. But 2 weeks later, this last Monday, as you've indicated, Stallings put a major condition on it. And I'm told today, just before we tape this broadcast, that that condition is the operative one. That unless Hansen's personal finances are disclosed in a manner acceptable to the Stallings campaign, there will be no debate.
And of course, no one, as a practical matter, really expects that that'll happen.
I certainly don't.
Which means, as a practical matter, the debate probably won't come off.
That appears to be the way it is right now.
Does this surprise you?
Yes, it did surprise me very much. I think I accepted the conventional wisdom that you cited in the beginning, that Richard Stallings should take every opportunity he could get to face down George Hansen. And I think fundamentally, too, Stallings talks about addressing the issues. And the issues he's talking about, farm policy, taxation, etc., are obviously, in the long run, the important issues. But I don't think you'd find a political observer who really believes that if George Hansen didn't have financial troubles, Richard Stallings would have much of a chance based on those issues alone. So it seems a little strange to say that the campaign ought to be waged just on those kinds of issues.
So in essence, Stallings' chance to win is a full and open discussion of the congressman's financial problems.
I would certainly think so.
Bob Black, do you agree with that? And are you at all surprised that Stallings says he doesn't want a debate, or has placed a condition on it in such a way that it's likely the debate would not come off?
I'm not surprised in looking at the way the campaign's developed so far. You have Stallings on one hand saying, look, we need to get on the issues. Hansen saying, that's fine, but I am an issue. But yet when pressed, Hansen doesn't really get too specific on a lot of his campaign or his financial problems. And with that in mind, I just can't see Stallings sharing a podium with him. Because really, Stallings will stand up there and make a few statements, and then Hansen will make a few statements, but not really answer the questions.
Yeah. Bruce Botka, you were at their sort of get-together yesterday before a realtors group here in Boise. What happened there?
Well, it was all very polite. Neither candidate did more than exchange handshakes and the briefest pleasantries. Each gave his own particular brand of stump speech. And I think there may have been a clue to some of Stallings' reluctance to share a podium with Hansen in those remarks they made yesterday. I think your clip showed that George is simply a better stump politician and more experienced at it than is Richard Stallings. And I'm wondering if there isn't some discussion within the Stallings camp that maybe they would be better off going it solo and letting the voters splice together their own combination of appearances.
Sam, what's your view of this from where you sit?
Well, I find myself in full agreement with Gene McNeil's observations concerning Stallings' reaction to a proposed Stallings-Hansen debate. I think, editorially speaking, that Stallings is at this point, by demanding that Hansen first disclose his finances before he will agree to a debate, acting as if he is some kind of prosecutor. If there is any demand for Hansen's financial records, a legitimate demand, it should come from the authorities and through the courts. I think Hansen and Stallings ought to discuss the issues, whether those issues be Hansen or national or international issues. I don't think such a condition should be put on Mr. Hansen.
Gene?
If I can jump in here, I do think, though, that Bruce made an excellent point, and that simply is that George Hansen is very good on the stump in that kind of situation.
Oh, yes.
And if I were Stallings' handlers, as they're sometimes called, I'd wonder about him going up against George Hansen, too.
Then you think it's more than simply finances.
Oh, yeah. I think ultimately these decisions are made on the basis of whether the candidate thinks they're going to benefit from a debate or not. And I would suppose that one of the reasons that they think maybe Stallings wouldn't is that Hansen is so good.
Bob Black, I guess the flip side of this is that if Stallings has basically ruled out a debate, it sounds like Congressman Hansen wants to debate, which is sort of a change of position for him from where he's been in past races.
That's true. I think in the last several elections, I don't think he's debated, but I think one candidate. And really, you know, from what was said before, I can't see where Stallings would benefit all that much from a debate at this point.
Well, let me just press you on that. Stallings talked in his press conference on Monday, and I know he had one in Idaho Falls too, about this $840,000 figure that's been bandied around in the last couple of weeks. The congressman, a bank account in a Glens Ferry bank that ran through that much money in a very short period of time, and he's asking how did it happen and where did the money come from. That's a good question, isn't it? And why wouldn't Richard Stallings want to put a question like that directly to George Hansen?
I think because he knows that George Hansen won't answer it, or at least he'll, you know, dodge it. Last night we were at a Republican barbecue, and several of us from the press went up and posed that question to George Hansen. And before long, you know, he was up on the stage talking about how the press were a bunch of gossips and we're not really on the issues. We're, you know, talking about George Hansen's personal finances. And I could see that happening in a debate as well.
So the congressman could take what many people would see as a legitimate question and turn it to his advantage. A legitimate question that might reflect negatively on him and turn it to his advantage.
I think that's what he's done so far in this campaign, and I can't see where he won't continue to do that right up to Election Day.
He has done that, hasn't he?
Well, he has heard that question a couple of times, more than a couple of times. But my reaction has always been, excuse me, wouldn't the viewers in a debate situation be able to evaluate for themselves whether he was answering the question or not? And I've wondered to myself whether it wouldn't be to Stallings' advantage to be in a position to pose the question in a format where George was forced to, if not answer it fully, at least address it, and take it on head on.
Gene, Bruce was suggesting a moment ago that there might be some disagreement in the Stallings camp. I think maybe you've talked to those people. Are they confused about how to handle this issue?
I think so. At the moment, they are referring, at least my question, and I think other people's too, to Stallings' press secretary. And I think they want one person answering everything precisely because there is some confusion. I think they realize, they realize that there's a contradiction here. They accepted a debate, and now they've essentially turned it down by attaching an impossible condition to it. And I think they realize that's a contradiction and that there's going to be a price to pay for that.
It was suggested in that videotape piece that we ran at the beginning of Stallings' news conference on Monday that one reason he might be reluctant to debate is because what polls exist show him anywhere between 15 and 30 points ahead. First off, do all of you think he is that far ahead? Sam?
Well, I have to react in the following manner. Polls this early in a campaign, I think, are subject to inherent questioning. In other words, negative questions.
Yeah.
No, I do not believe that he is 15 points ahead.
Bruce?
I think he might be 15 points ahead now, or he might have been 15 points ahead shortly after Hansen's conviction or his sentencing. But I don't think Stallings will ever be farther than 15 points ahead, and I would be very surprised if he maintained any margin like that at all.
You're agreeing, Jane?
Yeah, I think, normally you see those kinds of gaps close. That gap was pretty substantial, even taking into account sampling error and everything. But Sam is right. You see those gaps close toward Election Day. And I think, too, there's something that's going to come into play that several Republicans who are not necessarily Hansen fans have talked to me about, and that's that a lot of people who now intend to vote for Richard Stallings may, if they're fundamentally Republicans, have a lot of trouble doing that in November, and may end up sort of saying in disgust, well, I don't want to vote for George Hansen, but he's the Republican and I'm going to.
Bob, you watched this race from what is really George Hansen country, the upper Snake River Valley area particularly. Are people really talking about this contest?
Here and there, I don't, getting back to what was said before, I don't see Stallings running that far ahead over here. If anything, George Hansen probably has an edge on this side of the state. You know, the big question is how much support can Richard Stallings get from, you know, the west side of the state? Because as you move up the Snake River, you know, the Stallings support kind of wanes and the George Hansen support, you know, solidifies.
Bob, can I ask you a question?
Mm-hmm.
A couple of Republican, fairly high-up Republicans have indicated to me that they've been hearing from some pretty prominent Republicans in the Idaho Falls area. Precinct committeeman was one they specified, obviously unnamed ones, who have said that they will skip the race this time rather than vote for George. Have you heard anything like that?
I think there might be quite a few Republicans who will stay home. A lot of it is that we have a Republican president who is running in a state that, you know, has voted for Republican in every election since Harry Truman. There's not really, at this point, much of a Senate race shaping up. So I think we might see quite a few Republicans just not going to the polls. On the other hand, the party is well organized, and you know, I guess that's the question that remains to be seen. How much of the vote are they going to get out on election day?
Bob, let me change the subject slightly and ask you, you heard the congressman on the videotape refer to Geraldine Ferrero and the continuing story about her financial disclosure, and her husband's for that matter. Is that situation in effect sort of helping him by him being able to say, well, her situation is not that much different than mine?
I don't think it's going to hurt the congressman at all. Stallings is kind of saying, well, maybe she needs to, you know, look at her house too. He's kind of playing that, you know, that, well, you know, Hansen made a mistake and Ferraro made a mistake. Two wrongs don't necessarily make a right. But at this point, it looks like, you know, a lot of people are going to say, well, if it's happening in both parties, maybe we ought to just stick with Hansen.
Yeah.
A member of the Stallings campaign had an interesting response to that, and it essentially is what Bob just said, two wrongs don't make a right, but it was framed in different terms. It was, that's not an argument that any mother, and he specifically said mother, in the 2nd District is ever going to buy from their kids. In other words, everyone's doing it, so it's okay for me to do it. But my question then was, when are we going to hear Richard Stallings saying that? And I didn't get an answer to that question.
So would it be your feeling that this is helping Hansen and hurting Stallings?
I think it certainly, as Bob said, doesn't hurt Hansen, and I think it may help him, particularly if Richard Stallings is not willing to get out on the stump and say some very tough things about it.
Bruce?
I wonder if the voters on their own will ask the question not whether Hansen filled out forms correctly, but whether he should have been in the position he was in regarding the finances. Being in a position to move $840,000 through an account in a month, accepting loans from bankers in Virginia who certainly wouldn't have loaned George Hansen money if he were still the mayor of Alameda, receiving the tip in the silver futures market. Those are situations where I think the ethical questions can be asked, and I don't see Stallings asking those questions, and I'm wondering if voters will do that on their own or whether they consider it terribly important.
Well, let me ask you, do you think it's important?
Oh, I personally think it's important. I think it's a key issue in the campaign. But again, Hansen certainly portrays it as a bureaucratic paper shuffling type of situation and hasn't really addressed the morality of his actions. And if the voters see it the way he casts it, then George may be free and clear in looking at an 8th term.
Let me take the final few minutes here in a slightly different direction. The congressman has repeated the theme over and over in the last few months that the coverage of his case in the press in Idaho has been, to say the least, unfair. Sam, I know you've written some things about that.
Yes, I have, Mark. I really sincerely believe that the general coverage of Hansen's problems by Idaho reporters has been as accurate as humanly possible. But I believe that on a national level, he has perhaps suffered, to some extent at least, from a lack of interest. And by that I mean, Hansen has repeatedly charged that William French Smith, Attorney General of the United States, ran into difficulties with his reporting of his finances and was given a chance to alter. He wasn't prosecuted. He has also argued that his lawyers, that is Hansen's lawyers, advised him that he was doing the right thing. Did they? He has also argued that the IRS has had a hand in seeing that he was prosecuted when others weren't.
That's all been reported, though, has it not?
I wonder how much did William French Smith, in fact, get a second chance? In other words, if it's good enough for Smith on the one hand, why isn't it good enough for Hansen? Or if it's good enough for Hansen, why isn't it good enough for Smith? I'm wondering if the national media has explored these factors enough. I don't say that that detracts from Hansen's necessary guilt or non-guilt, but I think they're factors, and I think they've been largely ignored.
Well, what about the charge? He made it again on the videotape, saying that the press has basically pronounced me guilty. Bruce?
I agree with I think at least half of Sam's answer, and that is that the Idaho reporters that I know and the copy that I've read has been, on the whole, I think, pretty fair and more accurate than coverage I've seen of other kinds of stories. People in the media, I think, are going, in Idaho, are doing everything they can to be fair to George, and they know that their work is being more closely scrutinized, say, than the work of a reporter in Chicago or Washington as it pertains to Idaho in this race.
Bob, have you had you said that the congressman was complaining about questions that were asked of him just last night. Has he complained about something that your newspaper has done, for example?
Not in particular. He has complained a lot about Idaho's press coverage, as you well know. For the most part, I don't think we've been too harsh on him. Sometimes I wonder if we're not too tolerant of the congressman. But I think, for the most part, we've been, fair with him.
Gene, you've got the last 15 seconds to sum this up. I guess we're not the people to ask, maybe, but go ahead and try anyway.
Okay, my summation on a little bit different subject. I think probably the most critical thing here is Richard Stallings willing to take the risks involved in running a really aggressive campaign and dealing with these questions that we've been tossing around for the last half hour.
And not taking the risk might mean not winning in November.
I think it could easily mean that, despite what the polls might show now.
Well, Gene, thank you. Bruce Botka, thank you. Sam Lang, we appreciate you being here. And Bob Black and Pocatello, we thank you for making the drive. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks.
That's our time for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.